Chapter 3. We get more when we demand more. Disasters are ruptures. Existing systems break down and then are either repaired, replaced, or scrapped. Disasters exacerbate and expose inequalities, showing the pre-existing crises that elites strive to ignore and hide from view. When disasters emerge, governments and corporations quickly move to downplay them, hoping to get back to the status quo of extraction and profit-making as soon as possible, to take credit for having resolved them, and to silence demands for relief. Governments and the 1% also use disasters as opportunities to push their favored reforms. COVID-19, for example, has generated right-wing wins like closing the border, suspending environmental regulations, giving the FBI, DEA, and local police hundreds of millions of dollars, and expanding the capacity of police to harass and criminalize the poor for allegedly violating public health regulations. At the same time, disasters are opportunities for exposing injustice and pushing forward left-wing demands. COVID-19 has also been an opportunity for mobilizing people to resist injustice. As more people are laid off or forced to work dangerous jobs, we are increasingly standing together against landlords, bosses, police, prisons, and a profit-driven healthcare system. In seeking to curb the worst effects of the pandemic, some forms of government relief have emerged that give us hope for another way of life. Eviction moratoriums, increased unemployment benefits and income support, free public transit, suspension of student loan payments, and more. While this relief has been far from universal or adequate, it has demonstrated that many of the things our movements have fought for are entirely possible. Disasters are pivotal times in the competition between political programs, moments when much can be lost or won. Winning the world we want is far from guaranteed. Our opponents, those who currently control the most of the land, work, food, housing, transportation, weapons, water, energy, and media, are feverishly working to maintain the status quo of maldistribution and targeted violence, and worsen it to increase profits and power for themselves. Our capacity to win is possible to the extent that we can collectively realize what they do not control, us, and collectively disobey and disrupt their systems, retaking our control of our ways of sustaining life. If we want as many people as possible to survive and to win in the short and long term, we have to use moments of disaster to help and mobilize people. Mutual aid is the way to do that. During the COVID-19 pandemic, mutual aid groups have proliferated and more people are learning how to organize mutual aid than have in decades. This is a big chance for us to make a lot of change. We need mutual aid groups and networks capable of bringing millions of new people into work that deepens their understanding of the root causes of crises and inequalities that they are fired up about, and that builds their capacity for bold collective action. We need groups and networks that do not disappear after the peak of the crisis, but instead become part of an ongoing, sustained mobilization with the capacity to support people and keep building pressure for bigger wins. As mobilization builds, governments, corporations, and corporate media will approach mutual aid in 3 ways, all of which, as I write this, are already visible in regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. These 3 responses often happen simultaneously among different agencies, elected officials, and levels of government. Some will ignore proliferating mutual aid efforts. Some will try to fold them into a narrative about volunteerism, labeling mutual aid efforts heroic and portraying them as complementary to government efforts and existing systems, rather than as oppositional to those systems. And some police and spy agencies will surveil and criminalize mutual aid efforts. This was visible in the response to Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Occupy Sandy, a volunteer-based mutual aid network that emerged from Occupy Wall Street, organized over 60,000 volunteers to provide food, water, medicine, and other necessities to people left without power and in dire conditions by a government utterly unprepared to help them. The Department of Homeland Security extended its spying from Occupy Wall Street to Occupy Sandy at the same time that some New York City government agencies helped Occupy Sandy get supplies to redistribute. Governor Andrew Cuomo and New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg mostly ignored Occupy Sandy's frontline work as they focused on managing their own reputations. The fundamental goal of all three of these responses is to ensure the legitimacy and stability of the current systems and delegitimize alternative ways of meeting human needs. At best, mutual aid projects get framed as non-threatening, temporary adjuncts to existing systems. Elected officials and government agencies sometimes even seek legitimacy by associating themselves with mutual aid projects, if those projects are more successful at meeting needs than the government. At worst, mutual aid projects are portrayed as unlawful, dangerous, and criminal. As we saw with the police attacks on the Black Panther Party breakfast programs, or more recent Trump administration raids on the medical camps of No More Deaths, which offer support to migrants at the southern U.S. border, when mutual aid efforts truly build and legitimize coordinated action and autonomy against existing systems, governments typically crack down on them. The criminalization of mutual aid work has been ongoing throughout social movement history precisely because mutual aid directly confronts unjust systems and offer alternatives. Groups doing frontline mutual aid work that is particularly risky today, such as those helping with access to abortion drugs or procedures illegal in the jurisdiction where they are working, providing clean needles and safe consumption spaces to drug users where that is illegal, supporting the well-being of people in the criminalized sex trades, and helping homeless people occupy vacant homes, have useful knowledge and experience for all of us about navigating safety risks. Studying those groups' experiences and methods for evading and/or confronting police, securing electronic communications, and sheltering the most vulnerable people from exposure can benefit all mutual aid groups as we prepare for our work to hopefully become threatening to the status quo. In the face of increased mobilization and resistance, as with the rebellion against racist police violence in the summer of 2020, or fearing another destabilizing disaster, governments and the corporations they represent will sometimes grant concessions, many of which look similar to what mutual aid projects provide. In moments of deep social and economic turmoil, such as during COVID-19, governments expand income support, usually in the form of welfare benefits, unemployment benefits, or a one-time stimulus check. But government aid can also take the form of legalizing squatted property, providing mobile clinics, offering meals at public schools, creating restorative justice programs, creating resources for people being released from prison, and more. Concessions like these, where the government provides something previously only offered by mutual aid groups, can be celebrated as limited victories by movements. Our organizing was so strong, they had to co-opt us. These concessions might also provide vital support to many more people than mutual aid groups can reach, as with the USDA's free breakfast program in schools, which fed more children than the Black Panther Party breakfast program that prompted its expansion. However, it's crucial to remember that these concessions are necessarily limited. First, they can be shrunk or taken back whenever the moment of instability passes. This has been the historical pattern for poor relief in the United States. It gets expanded during a crisis and then contracted and stigmatized as soon as the crisis has lessened, quickly making people once again desperate and exploitable by their employers. Second, while government provisions sometimes reach more people than local mutual aid can, they usually exclude particularly vulnerable people, like people who are criminalized, working in underground economies, homeless, or undocumented. The welfare and income support programs in the United States, ranging from old age and disability benefits to support families in poverty, are consistently designed to ensure that women, people of color, and Indigenous people get left out or get less. For example, the New Deal, which emerged to quiet the anti-capitalist rebellions brought on by the Great Depression and stabilize the capitalist system, was designed so that women and domestic and agricultural workers, disproportionately Black and Latinx, were excluded from the benefits created. By tying many benefits to work, the New Deal also perpetuated a status quo of grinding poverty for people with disabilities. Whenever we rely on a capitalist, imperialist system to provide vital necessities, we can guess that the provisions will be fragile and inadequate and designed to transfer far more wealth towards the populations those systems were designed to support: white people, rich people, straight people, and men. Often, the concessions are never delivered at all, only promised in an effort to quell resistance. One pattern that is clear in regard to concessions is that because the aim of elites is to concede as little as possible and maintain the status quo as much as possible, we get more when we demand more and build bolder, bigger pressure. It took mass movements threatening capitalism's very existence, like those seen during the Great Depression and the 1960s uprisings against racism, just to get stigmatizing, ungenerous welfare benefits. Decades of uprisings against police brutality yielded only surface police reforms, many of which expanded police budgets and numbers. Even unsatisfying concessions, in other words, only come with big, sustained, disruptive mobilizations. Nonprofit leaders and politicians frequently encourage pragmatism and peaceful incremental change. But the most radical imagination of what we want and the escalation of direct action to get it is what is truly pragmatic if we seek to win real change. Concessions won in crises of sudden disaster and crises created by powerful social protest, will be as strong and lasting as the mobilizations that made them necessary. Elites and their nonprofit gatekeepers encourage us to make small, reasonable, or winnable demands, and they try to redirect our action to official channels that are non-disruptive, with narratives about peaceful protest and coming to the table. They encourage reforms premised on the assumption that the systems we seek to dismantle are fundamentally fair and fixable. We have to refuse to limit our visions to the concessions they want to give. What we want is a radically different world that eliminates the systems that put our lives under their control. If concessions are signs of our impact, at best providing some relief to some people, but ultimately stabilizing existing systems, what would winning look like? As we build mutual aid groups, what do we hope for, if not that the government instead of us will someday provide what we are providing? If our current systems are based on illegitimate authority and use coercion and violence to keep us tied to them, and if those systems primarily pursue the aim of concentrating wealth and decision-making power, what is the alternative? From our current vantage point, living in a world with the most militarized borders, the most expansive surveillance technologies, and the most severe concentration of wealth, the most imprisonment in human history, the most military bases and high-tech weapons, and the most advanced mechanisms of propaganda, it can be hard to imagine other ways of living. Disasters often stimulate fantasies of a benevolent government as we face brutal government failure and wish that things were different. Part of the reason our dream of a savior government is so compelling is that it is hard for us to imagine a world where we meet core human needs through systems that are based on principles of collective self-determination rather than coercion. we are accustomed to a situation where the choice is between a government that either denies the disaster's significance and abandons people to its devastations, or a government that responds with inadequate aid that comes with enhanced policing, surveillance, militarization, and wealth transfers to the top. This is no choice at all. Because of how capitalism controls the means for getting by, food, health, housing, communications, transportation, and how dependent we are on systems we do not control, it can be hard to imagine that we could survive another way. But for most of human history, we did, and mutual aid projects let us relearn that it's possible and emancipatory. Mutual aid projects let us practice meeting our own and each other's needs, based in shared commitments to dignity, care, and justice. They let us practice coordinating our actions together with the belief that all of us matter and that we should all get to participate in the solutions to our problems. They let us realize that we know best how to address the crises we face. And we don't need to be saved by professionals, government agents, or people elites consider experts. Mutual aid cultivates the practices and structures that move us towards our goal. A society organized by collective self-determination, where people get a say in all parts of their lives, rather than just facing a coercive non-choice between sinking or swimming, between joining a brutal and exploitative workforce, insurance scheme, or housing market, or risk being left in the cold. How do we imagine scaling up mutual aid to a point where everyone has what they need and gets to meaningfully co-govern and co-steward the structures and conditions of their lives? Because of the dominance of corporate and nonprofit models, people often think that scaling up means centralizing and standardizing projects. But this runs directly counter to the wisdom of mutual aid. Scaling up doesn't mean making groups bigger or merging them into one organization across a region, state, or country. Locally operated mutual aid works better for meeting people's needs in all kinds of situations, including disasters, because our needs are best met by those with the most local knowledge, and when we are the ones making the decisions affecting us. Scaling up our mutual aid work means building more and more mutual aid groups, copying each other's best practices, and adapting them to work for particular neighborhoods, subcultures, and enclaves. It means intergroup coordination and sharing of resources and information, having each other's backs, and coming together in coalitions to take bigger actions like rent strikes, labor strikes, or the toppling of corrupt governments and industries. Factory takeovers, where workers push out owners and take control of the factory, deciding together how it will run and making fair systems for all, are good examples of this type of shift. A labor strike that becomes a factory takeover is scaling up. Similarly, we might imagine people working to create local energy grids using solar power. The grids would be cultivated and cared for by the people using them, but they might be sharing practices and resources with other groups building and maintaining local grids. Governance and innovation remain local, but knowledge, support, and solidarity are networked and shared. To imagine a society where we share everything, co-govern everything, have everything we need, and don't rely on coercion and domination, we have to shed the capitalist propaganda that tells us people are naturally greedy, and that without police keeping us in our places, we would all hoard and harm. Instead, we can notice, as is particularly clear in times of disaster, that people are naturally connective and generous, though we often have cultural baggage to shed from being conditioned by white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. Again and again, we see people sharing what little they have after storms, floods, and fires, saving each other. Through mutual aid projects, many of us get a chance to deepen those practices of generosity and make them long-term support systems that we co-govern to help us all survive and mobilize for change. Mutual aid is only one tactic in the social movement ecosystem. It operates alongside direct action, political education, and many other tactics. But it is the one that most successfully helps us grow our movements and build our people power, because it brings people into coordinated action to change things right now. As mutual aid expands in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, in climate change-caused disaster zones, and during economic crises, we have a chance to cultivate millions of new resistance fighters, to teach ourselves to work together in long-term ways, and to develop our ability to practice solidarity-based co-stewardship in all areas of collective life. The climate crisis will continue to bring worsening disasters into our communities in the coming years and decades. The stronger we build our networks of mutual aid now, the more prepared we will be to help each other survive those disasters and transform our ways of living together towards liberation.